Hi, welcome to this episode of Authors Love Readers podcast, where we delve into the stories behind the stories. We ask authors questions, some of them fun, some of them serious, and from their answers, you're going to learn things you never knew about the people who write the stories you love. My name is Patricia McLinn. I'm your host and designated question asker.
I'm Jenny Wheeler, and I'm an author who loves readers.
Now, let's start the show. Hi, welcome to this edition of Authors Love Readers podcast. That's saying edition is really showing my newspaper background. Episode. But that's what comes naturally. On this episode, we have Jenny Wheeler visiting from New Zealand. And Jenny and I met virtually for the first time when she invited me on her podcast, The Joys of Binge Reading. And don't we all agree with that binge reading is wonderful and it's a joy. So Jenny, say hello and tell our listeners a little bit about what you write.
Look, that's lovely to be able to be here today, Pat. It really is. And it's a privilege too. I write historical mysteries set in 1860s, 70s California, even though I live in New Zealand. That might seem a little bit strange, but it was both passion and pragmatism that made me choose that topic. I took quite a long time to get around to deciding what I wanted to write because I'd been a journalist. The idea of writing something wasn't so intimidating, but I wanted to find the right niche. And actually, I don't think I did quite do that in the end, but I started out joining the Romance Writers Association in New Zealand because I always loved, I love popular fiction. I mean, that's one thing that I have to declare right away. And that's why binge reading is very much popular fiction, because in the 80s, all those very great women writers were doing the stuff like Shirley Conran and Judy Krantz. They were doing elevated romance, really, women's sagas and women's stories. And that was the sort of stuff I really gelled with. So it was a natural migration to think about writing romance. But after a few years of looking at the romance industry and perhaps trying my hand at romance, I went to a couple of workshops and things. I just decided romance wasn't quite for me, and I preferred to do mystery with just a romance subplot. So that's what I settled on. So mysteries first, and then I guess California has always fascinated me. I visited California quite a few times earlier in my life, and it's very similar to New Zealand in many ways, but it's just a bigger, better, greater canvas, not better, but a wider canvas on which to paint your story. So I had a few personal connections with the gold rush era as well. I mean, I lived near to a small town in New Zealand where we did have our own mini gold rush. And I had a great uncle who went from New Zealand to San Francisco in the 1840s, I presume because of the gold rush, although I don't know for sure, and brought back an American wife to New Zealand. So for all of those reasons, I kind of felt links to it. And also, to be more practical about it, I did want to start out looking for an international audience. I always knew I was going to be self-published because at this stage of my life, it's just not worth trying to wait around for a traditional publisher. And I also wanted to do more than the books a year that a trad publisher handles, like at least 2, hopefully 3. And they can really only handle 1 a year, most of them. So for all of those reasons, I settled on 1860s, 70s California, and I've never regretted it. I'm still very much, I'm writing book 11 at the moment, and I still am passionate about that period. But the only thing about it is it doesn't enjoy a hugely well-defined niche in the publishing industry. And I didn't take the sort of warning signs. At an early stage of this development, I pitched to an agent at a romance writers conference before I'd even written a word, actually. I just had a concept. And when I said 1860s California, she said, "Oh, we don't do Westerns." And I thought, 1860s California, late 1860s California, this is the stage where San Francisco is being talked about as the Paris of the West. There isn't a tumbleweed in sight. And yet it's kind of nudged in a lot of minds as being, the West and Westerns and smoking guns and things. So that it's hard to find, for example, that thing that Amazon always looks for, similar authors, because not many people are writing in that space, like Regency romance. Everybody knows what Regency romance looks like, or Gilded Age New York. That's starting to become a thing now. I think we should have a Gilded Age California. That's definitely what I'm working on.
I have about 140 questions coming off of that, Jenny. And the first thing I would say, though, is do you find that the readers have that reaction to the time period? The industry professionals get these certain thoughts. And one of the things that I discovered, having been trad and then coming into the indie world, was a lot of times they were just wrong. They were just flat out wrong. They thought this, was a law, and it wasn't. It was just a statement that was passed around, and they were just wrong. So how's the reaction from the readers?
Yes, no, I do think it is just a publishing thing. I don't think readers react that way. And also I get men as women readers, which I'm very pleased about. Yeah. But the thing is, it's difficult when they ask you to categorize your book. Do I put it as a Western or do I not put it as a Western? That's the kind of thing that puzzles me a bit,
Both. Do both, because you can draw readers from both, and you don't know. I have my contemporary mystery series is set, one of them is set in Wyoming. So it's definitely Western. And excuse me, let me apologize right now for Tessa in the background. It's been a tough day. There have been rainstorms, and she hasn't been outside, and she hasn't been to doggy daycare for several days because they're booked up. So we have a 1-year-old, lots of energy dog who is complaining bitterly. And, I'm not in charge of the weather, but anyhow. So I find that some people do come to the series, for many come from mystery, but some also come from Western. So I would say absolutely reach out to the readers in both areas.
Yes, it's just sometimes I wonder if the Western, they'll be disappointed because there's not a lot of people riding on horses and that kind of stuff. But anyway.
But all they have to do is see San Francisco, and they will get it.
Yeah, that's right.
And there was so much going on in San Francisco. And that brings me to the question about, where do you see the similarities between New Zealand and San Francisco, or California more broadly, but San Francisco?
I guess perhaps not quite. We've never had quite the equivalent of San Francisco in New Zealand, which is probably one reason that I chose to set my books there. But
we get to enjoy these other places, right?
But I think there's always, in fact, when I started to look into it, there's a lot of really interesting historic links between New Zealand and that period. I mean, the theatre that's credited with being the first theatre in California, which was the Eagle Theatre in Sacramento, which lasted about 3 months before it was rained out in one of their famous floods. But it was a canvas theatre. And on the billing was, quotes, the famous New Zealand soprano, Mrs. Hay. Now, I've got no idea. I've tried to find more out about Mrs. Hay, but she's disappeared into the mists of time. But that's where I got my idea of having a New Zealand singer in California in those years, right at the beginning. That sort of thing really happened. And a Maori concert party came through California in those years. There was actually a lot of contact between New Zealand and California. And of course, we shipped out a huge amount of our kauri forests to build those first villas, the painted ladies, etc. So there's a lot of links. There really is when you start to get into it. And I think it's probably the slightly more free-minded kind of spirit that a lot of Kiwis had, and that was famous in California, that attracted me as well. There weren't quite so many strictures in society, for example, against women. There were a few glorious years, perhaps then the kind of, morality police came to stay a little bit. But in the early years, women had a chance, apart from the very early years when there were hardly any women around except the soiled doves and the hotel keepers, or the, the boarding house keepers. But once society started to get going, and that's why I didn't choose the very early years of the gold rush, because I wanted a society which had hospitals and schools and women doing jobs other than being soiled doves and boarding house managers. But there was a lot going on there that just really was great for women before things got too settled again, and some of the old restrictions about what women were allowed to do were gradually imposed. So that was the other thing that really attracted me to it.
That's really fascinating, because I've read quite a bit about the people going west on the Oregon Trail. And one of the things that always fascinated me is many of the women were very independent on the Oregon Trail, and they did not wear all the petticoats because they would catch fire in the campfires, and women died from burning to death because of these petticoats. So they discarded them during the journey, but they put them back on when they settled. And I'm like, why? You know, you experience the freedom. Yeah. And I guess it's that connection to society, connection to what you knew. But I'm always thinking, no, just don't put them back on. And
that's partly because of the way they're going to be received by the other people. I mean, actually, that's interesting because in the very latest book that I've written, which is called Sadie's Vow, so I did 10 in the first series, which all hitched around 3 brothers who come back to California after having been separated when they were younger. And that series ran for 10 books, which was both the brothers and spin-off people that we met in the books along the way. Then I felt that series had been naturally completed, and I've started a new one, but still based on some spin-offs from the people, because actually you get to really want to know what happens to these people. So that one's called Sadie's Vow, and my heroine in that is a heroine who wears trousers to basically dissuade men from trying to hit on her in our jargon, you know. She's very independent, and it's one way of playing down her attractiveness so she actually doesn't attract male attention. And I did a bit of Googling around about women wearing trousers to see how likely that would be, and discovered that actually in the West, quite a few women did continue to wear trousers. I mean, it may not have been, but I found this particular blog which seemed to do quite a bit of research on it, which I hitched my wagon to, so to speak. And so I've got a heroine who part of the time wears trousers, but then does also start wearing dresses because she understands that she's not going to be seen as credible by some people if she wears trousers. She has to adapt to the society around her to an extent.
Well, and of course, it's not monolithic. If most women did something, that doesn't mean every woman did it. And if some people weren't outliers from the norm, nothing would ever change. We'd still be wearing 14 petticoats. Actually, those people would still have been wearing crinolines, and those people would have still been wearing, so there have to be outliers. People have to change, and they are often very interesting. And so they become part of our books. Now, we've talked a lot about the history, and you notice we went right into the books. We're going to have to come back and talk about you in a bit, but it fascinates me because you have the research of the history, but you also have the research of the mystery and what was going on with criminology at that point. And there were advances in that era and things happening. So how much research do you do with that aspect?
I don't really go terribly much into the criminology. My mysteries are more more about interrelationships and motivations, I guess. Yeah. But it is a fascinating time. I mean, book 2, Brother Betrayed, has got a part Chinese. He's not the first line character, but he is a very strong support secondary character, because this family originated in Hong Kong, although they're of English origin, originated in Hong Kong. and have very strong contacts. They've got a China basically based business, very strong contacts with China. So in the second book, we go a bit into the 6 communities and the way that the Chinese community, and there's, I mean, I guess I have got a history degree. The history of it all fascinates me. The food side of it with the Chinese coming into San Francisco. They had amazing networks that took Chinese delicacies via basically just single agent sellers right through into the mountains as they were building the railways. The Chinese could get all the food that they wanted, their pickled this and that, they could get it all through. So that side of it fascinates me as well. And then in Sadie's Vow, we go a bit into mob rule and the way that some of the Italian and other mafia type gangs started. So there's a bit of that in Sadie's Vow. So tremendously rich criminal history, but it is all more social and personality based than looking at things like, you know, footprints and that kind of thing.
Well, let's go back to usually where I start. Well, that's not really true. There's no usual things happen. But let's talk a little bit, let the readers get to know you a little bit. What got you interested in story? What drew you into, whether it was reading as a kid, and did you have a favorite book, or was there something else that got you really fascinated by story?
Look, I've always been a total bookworm. I grew up on a farm in New Zealand in days when you didn't really go out very much. I mean, you stayed on the farm, you know, you just didn't go out even to the movies. You might go to the movies once a year when you went to stay with your auntie and uncle, that kind of thing. We spent a lot of, it was both dairy, like my father milked cows, and sheep, dairy and sheep. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So you didn't get to go to the movies much.
No, and we didn't have TV until I was about 15. New Zealand didn't have TV in those days. So it was radio serials and books were the things that provided my entertainment. And I was a total bookworm. So I just read everything I could get my hands on. And I think one of the ones that just really made an impact on me was the famous 5 Enid Blyton series. I mean, being of English colonial stock, famous 5, Enid Blyton, and particularly the character of George, who is a girl who is very boyish, a very tomboyish girl. So yeah, right from the start, I kind of had that slightly independent streak and loved the outliers, I suppose.
So for me, it was Jo in Little Women.
Oh yes.
And there were subsequent books, and I read the whole series, beginning of my life of series books. So have you had a surprising job? Have you held a job, or is there a job, if you weren't a writer now, what would you be doing? So you can answer either or both.
Well, my surprising job would be the thing that's an utter antithesis for what I do now, and also all my talents and abilities, really. I started out, I mean, I think I might have mentioned I'm quite a pragmatic person. When I look back, I got a teaching degree, not because I particularly wanted to be a teacher, but in those days, a teacher was a great qualification to have if you were going to be a married woman, because you could have a family and still work because you had the school holidays off, etc. So I said to myself right at the beginning, if I'm going to be widowed with 6 children, I want to be able to cope. So I'll get a teaching qualification. So I did that, and I spent a year being a teacher and thought, no, this isn't for me. And I did all my secondary studies in Auckland in New Zealand, which is the main town in the North Island, but I was teaching in Wellington. So I had to get back to Auckland after I decided I didn't want to be a teacher. I didn't want to stay in Wellington either. So the job that I got to bring me back to Auckland was this particular job, which honestly and truly I did for a whole year, and I never really fully understood what it was about. I seemed to do it reasonably well. It was in a physics lab tracking pings on satellites, and all I had to do was learn how to work the equipment, but I never really understood exactly what it did, although it was all master's students, male, obviously, all of them, doing their thesis, and this was the kind of data side of it. I was totally unsuited for it. I mean, I did it, but just as a conscientious clerk, never really understood what it was. And even then I felt they were incredibly understanding and kind and accommodating, because I think it was clear to all of us that my eyes kind of fogged over when they started to talk about what the real meaning of it all was. So but it's funny how life works that way, because I took a second job as a waitress on a Friday night, because the first job didn't really earn quite enough. And through that job, I met a whole lot of journalists from the New Zealand Herald. I'd originally had this idea that I wanted to be a journalist, and then there were no role models for a woman in her early 20s wanting to be a journalist. They were all people like David Frost and that sort of level. And I couldn't identify with that at all. I'm not like that. I'm not male. I'm not 40. I'm not very clever and smart and confident. So but when I met these Herald journalists in my second job, I thought, oh gosh, I can be a journalist if these people are journalists. So this gave me the confidence to ramp up my application to the New Zealand Herald. And then the next year I got into journalism, so I could give up being a physics data collector.
So what did you do in journalism?
Lots. I spent 5 years as a general news reporter on the national daily in the country. And then I graduated. I did another 6.5 years as feature writer on the leading women's magazine. And then I graduated into management and ended up being an editor of papers and an editor of magazines. So wow. I did a lot in journalism. Yeah.
Do you find, I often say that I was a sports writer and then a sports journalist, and doing the reporting, I found that getting quotes, listening to people was a huge benefit in doing dialogue, because you learn how different people have, each person has an individual cadence. They have certain words that they use and don't use. And even if your notes maybe miss a word, you can hear it again because it's in their voice. Did you find that was beneficial?
Yes, I think so, although it was probably an unconscious thing. But the first book I wrote, which had a lot of faults, but the editor said to me, she thought that my dialogue was good. And I thought that was, and I just thought, oh, great, at least I can do something, that kind of feeling, you know. I think the other thing is that, you know, when you're doing a job like that, particularly if it's general news, you have to pick out what your lead's going to be. As you're interviewing someone, you have to kind of keep your eye out for what that lead in the story is going to be. And I think that helps you with seeing just the overall arc of a story and picking out your themes and seeing where it's got to go, that kind of thing. I think that helps, yeah.
You know, I don't know if we talked about this on your podcast, Jenny, but I write out of order. I write out of sequence. And I used to write news stories out of order. I would do the lead sentence last, unless I was doing run and sub for a sporting event where you had to. But yeah, I just, you know, outlier.
Yeah, definitely. I could not imagine how to work that way. It completely goes against the grain for me. I start with what the main thing is and work out from that, you know. Yeah.
And I think that should be so encouraging if anybody's listening who's an aspiring writer. The way you do it is the way you do it, as long as it gets those words down, you know. There is no one right way.
Yeah.
So, okay, do you have any favorite sayings, whether it's a motivational saying or something from your parents or
there's lots of things that I use to keep myself motivated. I am a person of faith, so there's quite a few biblical verses that I just keep front of mind. But one thing from a very long time ago that's slightly more secular, and it sounds like a cliche, but it is just so right. And certainly in some turbulent earlier years, I had a person that I really respected, a wise person who said to me, it's not what life does to you that counts, but what you do with what life does to you. And this was to me, it was kind of, wow. When I first heard that saying, now I realize it is almost a cliche, but it was just the thing that I needed to hear at that time.
Oh, yes.
And I think it's so right. It's absolutely true. But it was something I hadn't really thought about until then. Yeah.
And when it resonates for you like that, you carry it with you.
Absolutely, I think. Yeah.
So,
I mean, there isn't really anything that you should allow to bowl you over, if you know what I mean. That's, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I that's excellent. I have to ask you my question about my bizarre little desert island I have that somehow lets people play movies on this desert island, but only 3 movies. And so you have to watch the same 3 movies over and over and over until you either figure out how to get off or you're rescued, which is going to be a long time. So 3 movies. Which 3 movies are you going to watch over and over and over?
You know, it's interesting because number one, I think I mentioned to you, I'm not really a person. I don't repeat things. I don't even repeat even recipes.
That is
I'm
interesting.
a keen cook and I love trying new dishes, but even new dishes that I like, I don't redo them very often. I move on to something new. So my 3 movies, I would choose really schmaltzy things like Love Actually and Something's Got to Give and those sorts of movies. But really, I thought, honestly, Patricia, this kind of dated us because I think we should be looking at things like TV series. That's where the action is these days. So I would go for things like The Agent and The Lincoln Lawyer. And
well, I also think that's a sneaky way of getting more stories
it is
for the same amount. That's interesting to think about, you know, maybe your favorite streaming, but that is cheating because I did say movies and I've made the other people stick with movies.
Yeah, listen, I actually think it's interesting. I think our writing is more and more influenced by TV particularly. But a couple of nights ago, I started to watch an old movie, 1999 old, called, what was it called? Random Heart, I think it was. Harrison Ford and
oh no, that's the one I was thinking of.
Harrison Ford and Kristen Scott Thomas, Random Hearts, and it was from a novel, and it was fun.
But their spouses had a fling, and
they sit on a plane together, and they go down in the plane, and they're sitting next to each other, that one, and it was a fun movie, but I actually thought at the end of it, well, not a lot happened there. You know, my writer mind went over what the plot line was. You know, they sat together in a plane, they went down in the plane, and the spouses found out. If that was done today, there would be a million other distracting plot lines and characters and things. We seem to like to have complication after complication these days. And it felt at the end of it, I had that feeling of, oh, that was sweet, but is that all?
But I feel sometimes with the modern ones, there's so many complications. It's unbelievable. It's not believable. And it just defies my belief. And I start to lose interest because it's defied my belief and because it's taking me in too many directions. I want to stay with a story. And yet when you said Love Actually, I thought, you know, that's a really good pick for the desert island as a writer in particular, because there were so many stories woven in there, and you could take those stories and then expand them and continue them, and you'd have all these stories in your head to continue.
That's right. And that's probably one of the few movies that I quite often do watch it again every Christmas.
Oh, I watch movies over and over and over. Yeah, we really have different mindsets here. So I am going to make sure that I get to some of these questions from the readers, because I have been known to, you know, just keep asking questions. So and I'm going to combo a couple of them. But first, I want to ask this one that the reader says, where do your stories come from? And she has said that she talked to a writer who dreams her stories, and someone else who has a character who just takes up residence in her head. And I always love it that the reader said then, so how are your beautiful stories born?
That's gorgeous. Yes, I've talked to writers who have dreams, which really impresses me. I don't think I've ever had a dream about a story. I think, honestly, I'm just a lot more, they use that word again, pragmatic, but having been a journalist, I guess I started to understand what the building blocks of stories were. So I knew you needed, you know, the hero character, the villain character, you need the best friend. So I do really plan a story in a much more workmanlike, I hope craftsmanlike, maybe coming now after nearly 12
artisan
books,
How about artisan?
artisan, that would be good. Yes. I start with the couple of key characters who I'm really interested in. I just think about them. What do they want out of life? What's the most important thing they want right now in their lives? And what's stopping them from getting it? I guess that's where I start, with both of the key characters. And because it's a mystery that does have a romance subplot, I always have two characters who, are going to vaguely end up together, if not exactly married. They're going to be thinking about getting married by the end of the book. I mean, that's the HEA, the happy ever after, as they say, of romance. And
See,
I do stick to that.
I call it the happy beginning, because I always think of my romances as getting the characters from a point where they could not be together to a point where they can start their lives together in whatever fashion that is. So it's the happy beginning.
That's a great way to look at it, actually, Patricia. It really is, yes, because my characters don't really get very far along the romance trail, but they do get to the point of deciding that they really want to be together. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's very much about personal motivation of the characters. And I've got some characters from really early books that I've never developed a story about, and perhaps never will, but I would really love to know how their life turned out. There's a woman who gets widowed in the very first book, Anna Santa Maria, and I often think of her and think, I wonder what happened to her. Widowed, and she had one son, and she was caring for her brother-in-law's 5 children when the brother-in-law is killed.
Wow.
So she's left with 6 children in Sacramento in the 1860s. How did that work out for her? I still might end up writing that story sometime. I'm just not sure. But there are people like that who I think, I wonder how her life turned out. That's really what the answer for me is.
So if you were going to write her book, you would start with her. You have her as the character, and you have her situation. What would you do next?
Well, I very first thing I would do is decide what period I was going to set this in. Am I going to pick it up right there, or am I going to give her a few years and those children a little bit more grown? So that would be the very first decision, and I'm not quite sure what that decision would be. Then I would think about what would be a sort of a realistic, but I suppose aspirational path for her to take. Something, she's not going to end up being California governor. That would be too big a stretch. But what could she ideally expect from life? And how is she going to be able to get that? That's where I'd start. Yeah.
Interesting. So you think of the aspiration rather than necessarily the obstacles for her life.
I think of the aspiration, and then I think, what are the obstacles?
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, another reader asks, what is your favorite place to write? And I can see Jenny through video, so I'm guessing it may be where you are right now. And the reader also asks if it has an inspirational view. And I can't see the view, but it has a wonderful peaked window.
Yes, it's the top of a house with gables, and it's my office. And it does have a beautiful view, which I never look at when I'm writing.
Because you're so good. You're never distracted.
I think you need a blank wall to write.
I managed to pick the hottest room in the summer and the coldest room in the winter as my office. So I'm envious of people who have more commodious offices.
Actually, my fiction writing career coincided with moving house. I had something happen in my life that forced me to move from the house I'd been in for 25 years. And I was looking to where I was going to buy. And when I walked into this house, it's got a gorgeous view, an 180-degree sea view looking over the top of the Auckland Harbour.
Jenny.
And I walked into this room and I thought, this is where I could write my books. So I bought the house. I mean, it's not quite that simple, but it is like that. I walked into this room and I thought, this could be where I write my books. And that's what's happened.
Wow. Talk about an inspirational view. That is truly an inspirational view. Wow. What a great answer, too. I think our reader would be delighted to hear that answer. We have a couple other readers, and I'm going to combine it because one is, how much does it bother you when you find typos or editing mistakes after the book has come out? And the other is, how do you feel about the cover image? And the reader was looking at it as it really bothers this reader when the cover image, especially of a character, doesn't match the description. But talk to us a little bit about how you approach covers and also how you feel about typos.
Look, I absolutely hate typos, and I'm not.
I had a feeling.
I never was a terribly good sub-editor. I was an editor who ran both magazines and a newspaper, where I was good at story ideas and good at directing staff and good at deciding, I hope, what stories we could run. But the mechanics of grammar and, commas and whether the full stop should go inside the speech marks or outside, all of those things were very much things I left to the sub-editors, and absolutely respected the sub-editors. And so it's not my natural inclination to be able to do that stuff. And so I really relied on other people for that, and they did a wonderful job. But afterwards, I had readers saying, oh, there's quite a few typos in this book. And I think, how could that happen? And actually, really, it's annoyed me so much, particularly with book one, that just in this last few weeks, I've gone back and totally retweaked book one to get rid of everything I hate in it, because now I'm up to book 12 or 11. I think I've done that thing called develop a voice quotes, although I don't quite know how that happens. It's still a big mystery to me. I just know now that when I look at book one, I think, oh, that doesn't really read. Oh. So I just couldn't stand the thought that this was going to be the book that would introduce me to readers, when I think it could be improved so much. So I've just been back and gone over and over and over it, trying to find every single little thing that's wrong with it. And it's currently at the format is being reformatted so I can upload it again. So that's how I feel about it. I hate typos. And I have a friend who was on the magazines with me who's really good with typos. So I now pay her to read my books and get everything right. So in more recent books, it hasn't been such a problem. But I do think probably almost every book has, it takes a tremendous amount to remove every single thing, doesn't it?
Oh, yes.
It really does.
Oh, yes. You don't see them. You just don't see them. But the other thing, in going back to your previous books, I do this periodically, which sounds like it's really organized, and it's not. It's just, something will pull me back into the book for some reason. And the danger to me is I could go back over those over and over and over. I could just continually cycle through my 60 books and change things, because you're always learning, you're always changing, you're figuring things out, you're better at expressing, you have a better grasp of that character, or you have a different view, a bit more depth of the character view. So it's both good to go back through the books and dangerous, I think.
Yes.
You could get on that merry-go-round forevermore and not progress, not go off and do new material.
Yeah, 60 books is so impressive, Patricia. It really is. I mean, I think I will leave it with book one, but particularly as that's the one that I give away everywhere free. I want it to be as good as it can be. And as for the covers, I've had a really good cover designer in the UK that I've used all the way through. But I do agree, the one thing I don't like, I like to make sure that the girl on the cover has got the same color hair as what I've said in the book, because that just so stands out if it's not quite right. And I think readers will notice that. So that is the one thing that I really try and make sure we get right.
Interesting. Okay. Another reader has asked, if you could write a book with any other author, living or dead, who would you choose and why?
Oh gosh, that's so hard. Oh, I don't know. I mean, some of the people that I've interviewed were such fun that I would like to see more of them. I mean, one name that immediately comes to mind is the UK author Jill Paul. Mind you, she doesn't really write the sort of books I write, but I think she'd be fun to work with. Yeah.
What about her writing would you want to work?
She's done quite a lot of books which combine fictional and factual, like she did one on Jackie Onassis and Maria Callas. And going back into their lives and seeing how they were rivals, but how their lives interconnected. And I love stories that are semi-based on fact. I guess that's the journalist once again. And I really enjoy being able to inject real fact, historical fact into my stories, even though, I don't let it overwhelm them. But I love those sorts of stories which give you fact as well as the story. So that might be one of the reasons. Yeah.
That's great. Do you have a particular genre or couple of genres that you enjoy reading for fun?
Yeah, it's really this thing that's been happening with popular fiction, the historically based fiction, a lot of it at the moment, Second World War, but I love stories that combine that true life stuff with fiction. And there's a tremendous amount of work going on that is shining a light on the so-called lost women. And for example, Hemingway's wives, apart from the one who became the journalist, whose name totally escapes me right now.
She was a photojournalist?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, whose name I also can't remember.
The first one, Hadley Richardson, the very first wife. I think that Paula McLinn wrote a story about her, and that bringing those women, that particularly the women that supported the great men and just lived in the shadows. There's one that I've just finished, and I hope the author's coming on my show in the next month or so, Whitney Shara's book called The Age of Light, which was about Lee Miller, who was another photojournalist in the Second World War. She was also a terrifically talented photographer in her own right, and she had an affair with Man Ray in Paris before, when she was just in her 20s. Man Ray was 17 years older than her, a surrealist artist. And I didn't know, the only thing I knew about Lee Miller was that she'd been a photojournalist who landed with the American troops when we got back into Europe at the end of the war. And she was the first photojournalist into both Buchenwald and Dachau, but I didn't realize that actually until I read Whitney's book. But it's just the most wonderful story about a young woman in her 20s in Paris in the 1920s, trying to make her own way, trying to be recognized as an artist in her own right, not just as a beautiful woman hanging on a man's arm. And that's the sort of story I love the best. And there's so much good stuff coming out. Alison Pataki is another one I think of, who's doing stories about the European royals, the Hungarians and the Austrians, and some of their women that have got buried. I think she did one about Napoleon's first love, who he rejected for Josephine in the end, but she went on to have the most amazing life that none of us have really ever heard much about. So that's the sort of story I really love.
So she ended up being fortunate not to have gone with Napoleon.
She did end up fortunate. Yeah. Her husband ended up being basically allocated the Swedish crown. She became Queen of Sweden, and she helped found a dynasty which is still alive today.
That's wonderful. And it strikes me that what you're doing in your historical mysteries also has elements of this. And then you add in murder.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Yes. So that's
I think these stories about the sort of semi-forgotten woman is just one that really resonates with me. I mean, I did a history degree, but when I was doing history, the only history that sort of counted was the political government history that men made. And if I'd stayed on to do an MA, I would have wanted to do social history, and that just wasn't judged as being worthy of attention. And I've perhaps been on a lifelong mission to try and say, hey, listen, the domestic is just as interesting as the political,
Oh, it's fascinating, I think. I remember I found a book called Bride of the Bozeman, and it was a woman who had married on the East Coast, and then she and her husband, for their honeymoon, went across the Oregon Trail and then up this northwest route from the Oregon Trail to Montana. And it was called the Bozeman Trail. And this was a book that her family had published of her memoirs and then also letters she'd written home. So her diary, I think at the time, and letters she'd written home. One of the things that I always loved about it is the diary was a little sharper than the letters home. She softened some of the edges, especially about other people. And I just thought, oh, she's so human and she's so wonderful. And I cherish that. So I totally understand. And those give such a view of what the life was like and of human beings. And I think a lot of times the way history is taught, we sort of forget the human beings. You talked about World War II. My dad was in World War II, and he came like D-Day +4, I think, from England into France, and he was in the Battle of the Bulge and all these things. And you just, those are in history, those can be troop movements and political, and which general was doing what. But for me, always, because of his experience, it was very personal. And it was, what were the individuals doing? What were they feeling? What were they thinking? I find that fascinating. Went to one of his World War II units reunions years ago now. Dad had taken movies after the bulge, after the fighting stopped, but there was still all the snow and the huge pine trees with the snow, and the men wearing blankets wrapped around their heads, tied around their heads and tied around their feet because they didn't have the winter uniforms. And it was like 94 degrees in Richmond, Virginia. And of course, we're in air conditioning in a hotel, but it was the heat of summer.
Yeah.
And these men were watching this and shaking because the memory of being cold, and this was 50 plus years later, the memory was so visceral. And I was deeply impressed by that.
Yes.
But okay, I got way off. So let me ask, what do you think that people have misconceptions about your subject or your genre? What's the biggest thing that they think they know and they're maybe not right?
Well, I think perhaps, let me just think about this. I mean, apart from the fact that, there's not a tumbleweed in sight, if they're really looking for a Western. But I guess the other thing is, I think that sometimes my books are perhaps, they're not cozy mysteries as such. So sometimes they might, I like to be a little bit provocative, I suppose. So they're definitely not cozies, although sometimes with those book suite things, I put them into the cozy grade. But so I get, like in the first book, there's a bull and bear baiting scene, which is something that happened everywhere in California in those years. And I took the description from an actual eyewitness account. When you were talking about the memoirs, I was thinking how wonderful memoirs are, because they can give you, even if it's just a couple of paragraphs, they can give you. And I had some people reviewing it on Amazon, giving it a 1-star, saying it's full of animal cruelty. And this kind of, I thought, it shocked me at first, because I thought, oh gosh, I mean, number one, it's not really that terrible. I mean, it is, it does make you sit up, I guess, but that is exactly how it was. It's a memoir, but also that's what happened. When I rewrote the book just this last few weeks, I thought about taming that down, and I decided, no, I wasn't going to do that. It's real, it's justified. Somebody didn't like it. And actually, since then, I've come up across an Australian author that I absolutely love called Adrian Hyland, who's coming on the show. I've already recorded his episode. It's coming up in a few weeks. But I loved him because he was so good at capturing Australian landscape, but also running a good mystery at the same time. It's a mystery with almost a literary edge. His writing is so good. And when I looked around online, I found that somebody had given him a 1 star and said something like, not bothering with this rubbish. And I thought, I'd also read somewhere, every single author gets a 1 star, don't let it touch you. And when I saw Adrian getting a 1 star, when I had felt he was like a new discovery in my life, and actually he was one person I thought, oh, I'd love to write like this. I really would love to write like this. And he got a 1 star. I thought, oh, look, just don't let it get to you.
Yeah. Sometimes I think that you could write HE for he and somebody would get angry,
Yeah.
Somebody's not going to like it. How dare you use the he or the THE, So I think you can't write for the people who don't like your books. You have to write for yourself, I think, first. We spend the most time with the books. A lot of people say we write for the readers. So if you're going to write for the readers, you got to write for the ones who like your books, who like your stories.
Totally. And I think that traditional publishers, getting back to that, they do stick to categories. And some of the best indie authors, the most popular indie authors, are the ones who've successfully managed to crash categories and still get an audience. So, it is out there to do that. Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking when you talked about that yours aren't maybe the common label of cozy, I think that label has changed. Would they fall under cozy back when Agatha Christie was writing and they were first called cozies? The
probably not.
Yeah, still not. Okay, I think mine probably would.
Yes.
What I think of as a traditional mystery.
Really yes, probably they would. It. Yeah, they probably would fall into that category. They would.
Yeah. So I think cozies have morphed, and either we need another term for these books, or cozies need to open up a little bit more and not all have donut shops or muffin shops.
That's right. They've tended to be a small town where the same characters come through time and time again. Well, that isn't quite what I do, and it's not quite as reassuringly everything's going to be all right in the end. I mean, some people still end up dead or hurt or, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes. So when you're writing, what do you do when you get stuck, or do you not get stuck?
I think every writer gets stuck in the sense that you might feel the story's going off the boil a little bit, that you kind of, this is getting a bit flabby, or I'm not really sure that this is working very well. I don't believe in writer's block. I mean, I say that almost challengingly, but I mean, having been a journalist for 30 years, I've just learned how you just sit down and start writing, that's but if I do come to that point of flabbiness, I think probably a couple of things. I mean, just getting outside and having a walk is a great way to kind of help clear your mind, or just taking a bit of a step back, sitting in the sunshine and just going over some of the storylines again and thinking, have I lost the way with this character? Have I let him or her go off the boil a bit? And I think that's the way I do it. Look at their motivations, their character, and just take a step back and also just have a break. They're very simple things, but that's probably works for me.
Do you do charts or character interviews or any of those sorts of things?
Not really. I mean, perhaps if I get stuck, I might do that sort of thing. There was one book, I mean, I've read a lot of craft books, and when I started out, I followed, I can't even remember what his name is now, but I followed one called Scene and Structure. And that helped me to even understand at the beginning
Bickham?
When I was writing, I didn't even read
Jack.
Yeah, that's it. Jack Bickham. Yeah. Scene and Structure. Honestly, I'm embarrassed to say, when I first started writing book 1, I didn't actually even understand that thing about scenes. I didn't really know exactly what a scene was. I mean, obviously I'd read many of them.
Yeah.
And so I actually quite honestly followed a template that he had in the back of that book for a mystery. And the first book that I wrote, I really stuck to that template quite closely and did the sort of points where he said you had to have a climax and that kind of thing. And then I moved on to the story grid and the sort of climax structure they have. And the first few books, I almost plotted them out ahead of time. And I said to myself, I'm a journalist. I need to know where I'm going with this. So I did quite heavy outlining. But as I've gone along, my process has changed. And now I'm a combination of outliner and letting the story flow as well. And I find that a very much more satisfying process to use, I think. I need to have some outline. That's just my personality, I think. And I probably do have an idea where I want the characters to end up at the end. But sometimes quite often, I'm not really sure how the second half of the book's going to unfold.
And I will say again to aspiring writers, I'm a journalist and I can't know where the story's going, or I'm bored. So it's whatever works for you. And I almost missed a question from a reader, and I want to make sure I get this one in. And the question is, do you miss the characters when you finish a book? And go ahead.
If I'm writing the next book, no, I don't miss them because I'm already really engaged with a new set of characters. But I do sometimes wonder what happened to them. And I even think about, in the back of my mind, I think maybe I'm going to end up writing a series which is set 20 years further on, and which features their children as the main characters, just so I can find out what happened to their parents' generation.
But you can't have any of the parents' generation dying. They have to still be around.
I guess they do still have to be around.
Yeah. I'm saying this as a reader. You can't push people out. They can be grandparents, but they have to still be around.
Yeah.
Okay, before we get to the either ors, let me say, is there anything I haven't asked you that you would like to answer?
No, I don't think so. I think I feel as if I've gabbed on far too much, but
no, not at all. I could keep asking questions. This is always dangerous. Okay, so this is a rapid fire either or. No negotiating here. Okay. Ready?
Yep.
Paper plates or best china?
Best china.
Day or night?
Day.
Pickup or sports car?
Pickup. I've got an unrealized ambition to have a pickup.
House decorating or gardening?
Gardening.
Mountains or beach?
Mountains.
Opera or show tunes?
I think opera.
Hiking boots or cowboy boots?
Hiking boots.
Sailboat or motorboat?
Sailboat.
Jigsaw puzzle or crossword puzzle?
Crossword puzzle.
Daisies or roses?
Roses.
Appetizer or dessert?
Dessert.
Winter Olympics or Summer Olympics?
Winter Olympics.
Mustard or ketchup?
Mustard.
Spring or fall?
Spring.
Ice cream or cake?
Ice cream.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Cat or dog?
Dog.
Binge watch or make the watching last as long as possible?
Binge watch.
Okay, and then the other is grab the best first or save the best for last?
Save the best for last. I'm an inveterate delayed gratification person.
So that does fit with the binge watching, holding on until you can binge all the way through. Yeah.
What I get, like Lincoln Lawyer was the last one. Sometimes if I start a series, I'll sit there until 3 a.m. watching it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, this has been terrific, Jenny. Thank you so much for taking the time to be.
Oh, thank you. It's been such a great conversation. I've loved it.
Oh, good. I'm really pleased that you did. And I'm glad to have you as a guest and to thank you for having me as a guest on your show.
I was going to look up and see what number you were. I mean, I've got I'm on 230 now, and I think you were probably about 50, something like that. So it's a while ago.
Yeah. Boy, that's a lot of podcasts, folks. It's a lot of work to put these together. Fun, but it's a lot of work. So I hope all of you will come back for our next episode. And in the meantime, I wish you a lot of happy listening and happy reading.
Thanks so much, Patricia.
I'm also here to ask you to help support Authors Love Readers podcast. You can do that in a number of ways. Of course, we would appreciate very much your joining us on Patreon, where you can pay as little as $1 a month to show your support for the podcast and to help keep it going. As a one-time deal, you can also do something called Buy Me a Coffee. There's a link to that on my Facebook page. That's Patricia McLinn's Facebook page. And there will also be a link on the Authors Love Readers website and Facebook page. In addition, we love to have you subscribe and to like the podcast, and comments. Comments are always welcome, and especially spreading the word to your fellow listeners, readers, maybe aspiring writers, anybody who you think would enjoy these conversations. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that support. That's the show for this time. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for joining Authors Love Readers podcast. Remember, you can always find out more about our guest authors in the show notes, and you can find out more about me at www.patriciamclinn.com. You can also send in questions to be asked of future guests at podcasts@authorslovereaders.com. Until next time, wishing you lots of happy reading and listening.